This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 397. Does immigration slow inflation?
As of May, the US was short 1.6 million foreign-born residents compared to growth before Trump's restrictive policies. Now, the European Union has a labor shortage too, but in a rare bright spot of the Ukraine war, Europe is seeing an influx of refugee workers. Imagine how the US could ease its worker shortage if it took in more refugees and economic migrants. That would also go a long way toward fighting the other problem on everyone's minds, inflation.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So is that right, that immigration can help slow inflation, and if you have less migration or less immigration, there's a chance then that inflation is going to rise? Is that a chunk of what is happening now? That is Fareed Zakaria from CNN. He seems to think so, and certainly central banks seem very concerned about wages. So is tightness in the labour market, as they call it, the real reason that inflation is so persistent? We'll look at that this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. We also have a bit of listener feedback to address on the podcast today. So we will look at emigration a bit later. Emigration to Mars. Oh, yeah, that again. But first of all, immigration. Stopping it seems to be a surefire vote winner. It certainly was part of the Brexit vote, wasn't it? And the reason that was so successful in the UK, and it'll probably be part of the downfall of the current UK government, because they're not bringing it down as fast as people like, because Johnny Foreigner steals our jobs, probably because he is going to do it for less than any of us. He's also, of course, on the dole as well as stealing our jobs somehow. The flip side of that is, if foreigners bring down wages, that is a major component of inflation. So that's good, isn't it? In fact, central banks right now seem most worried about wage inflation. So would it be even a bigger problem without immigration? So, Steve, do you think there is this correlation between migration and inflation? Can we bring down inflation by bringing in more people? I mean, there is the counter argument, of course, that we bring in more people chasing the same resources. That could see prices go up. I guess it all depends on the people and what they consume and what jobs they do.
Yeah, it's one of these tortured areas because it doesn't just bring out economic issues, it brings out a large amount of human prejudice as well. And but I find that the focus upon GDP growth on its own is partly where this hassle comes from, because if you're talking about increasing GDP, then potentially bringing in more workers, more population means you can produce more, maybe more output that way. But it's output per head that gives us the idea of a level of individual welfare. And when you look at output per head, then in one sense, immigration is irrelevant unless it's providing something that you can't do with your current workforce. And then it comes down to what type of economic performance you're talking about. And these issues seem to be forgotten in most of the debate. People just focus upon those who are pro it as saying, okay, it's going to increase employment, increase output. Working immigrants will do jobs that locals don't do. There are interesting issues inside there, but I think it's one of these things which clouds the debate in so many ways. But
people, I mean, the reason why people talk about more, as Australia talked about a big Australia, didn't it, at one stage? I think that was part of, was it Kevin Rudd who was arguing for a big Australia during his role as Prime Minister? And I guess the argument there is if you've got the space and the resources, then I guess you're going for economies of scale, aren't you? I mean, you believe that population can reach a point where it's just more efficient to have more buyers and companies can elevate their scale and get better returns.
That's the long-term perspective, and it depends upon, how much do you actually have the physical resources to support that many people. So, yeah, that's like if you look at the whole reason for forming the European Union, it was because in many, well, not the only reason, but one of the major ones was that Europe regarded each of its individual countries as substantially smaller than America, but its total population is larger than America. And if you want to get economies of scale, so you have large-scale manufacturing, for example, let's take a random example. Let's say, for example, I don't know, airplanes?
Yeah.
Does that sound like a good example?
Sounds like a good one. Yeah.
Okay, well, the larger economy out of which you're producing aeroplanes, the more aeroplanes you can sell, and therefore the larger scale the factory you can work with, and so on. And so, that's just, maybe we use the word like Boeing. Does Boeing sound like a good name for an airline company? And
it sounds like a lousy name for an airline, actually. It sounds like the sort of airline that would make
falls
planes
out of the sky,
fall out of the sky.
Yeah, but that's the economies of scale argument for a larger population.
Airbus sounds a better name.
Well, air tends to float. In the bus, you stay in the bus. The bus doesn't tend to run off the road all the time. So maybe Airbus is a better name. Yeah, but this.
So you're saying it's the sort of, you need an economy the size of amalgamated Europe or the US, so you can support such a big industry, is what you're saying.
Yeah, Europeans will see a similar thing when they go travelling around the continent. For example, I've been just living in Budapest for most of the last half of the year, and I find I've got Spar, SPAR, as one of the retail outlets. And Spar you'll find all over Europe. It's a chain which operates across multiple countries. Whereas if you had it, I think it actually began. I'm not sure which country it began in, but one of the chains began in the Netherlands. And if you just had a legal framework and a political system that worked for a single country, then it would be a smaller scale of operation. Well, what we're talking about with population growth is you're saying you got population. Let's take Australia's population 30 years ago, maybe 15 million people. The big Australia argument was if we get to 45 or 60 or 80 million people, whatever numbers the big Australia types were talking about, then you have a larger domestic market, and you can therefore have larger output levels and larger economies of scale. But what that ignores, and this is something which people who criticise the big Australia argument made, is that if you're going to be growing the country by growing the population, then to grow the population in an adequate sense, you've got to provide the services that population requires. The simplest one, obvious one, is schools, roads. If you're going to have more people, you're going to have more houses, you're going to have more need to.
No, but you're getting in more tax. Obviously, you're getting in. But you'll have more people to perform those roles as well.
But what it means is you're building technology, which the expression was used was capital broadening. Okay, you need more schools. You don't need better schools. Whereas actually, what you might actually need for quality development is an improvement in the quality. Not just. Yeah.
But that's where you start to say, well, okay, we'll be selective about who we bring in, or we'll have a program where we get higher skilled migrants.
Or you balance growth of population against improving the technological capability of the resources you currently have, and that tends to get swamped in the big. This is actually what appeals to politicians so frequently. The simple approach is the easier one for them to do. So John Howard, who was famous for demonising Chinese migrants and migrants in general, back in the I think it was the 1998 election, where he won largely because a group of refugees turned up in a boat and were collected by a boat called the Tampa, and he then stamped his foot and talked about, we will talk about the conditions under which people come to this country and how many come to the country. But at the same time, he was drastically expanding visas for migrant workers, which avoided some of the protections that were accorded to local workers. And in fact, under his anti-immigration government, immigration increased because of these visas to benefit the business sector rather than benefiting the population as a whole.
Sounds strangely familiar with the UK currently, doesn't it, really, where there's a lot of demonising of people who are arriving illegally, to use that the phrase they use, whether you're seeking asylum is illegal or otherwise, while this massive increase, over 600,000 net increase in legal migration coming into the country. So you'd say, well, okay, if the argument is that if you have more migrants coming into the country and you've got lots of job vacancies currently, then those migrants will come, they'll take up those jobs. That will mean that there's less of a push on increasing wages, and that will hold back inflation. Which, sounds fair enough. If you believe, it's two questions out of that. How important is wage pushes to the cause of inflation, particularly the inflation we're seeing now? And if that is the case, how come the UK has such high levels of inflation, even though it's got a net migration of 600,000? So, in other words, the argument isn't being supported by the evidence.
Well, the evidence. I mean, when you take a look at the evidence. They've only done this for the United States, but I could probably fairly easily do it for the UK as well. When you decompose what's causing the inflation right now, I follow Koleski's way of looking at price inflation. I've thrown a little line towards the MMT crowd in America on this front, by the way, because the usual argument is increasing the money supply causes inflation. Let's steal a slogan from the NRA. And, the old guns don't kill people, people kill people. Money doesn't cause inflation, people cause inflation. And when you break it down, what people can cause prices to rise, it's firms deciding to increase their markup or workers demanding a higher wage level. And then the third sort of person is the engineer. It's how productive your system is. What's the rate of the time delay between inputs and outputs in a factory? And that's where supply chain issues come up. When you break it down to those three components, markups, wages, and supply constraints, the most recent bout of inflation began with a bit of wage inflation back when COVID first hit. But since then, it's been by far the main causes of inflation have been increased markups and reduced productivity. And migration will not help with either of those.
Yeah. Well, big productivity because you'd make less investment in machines because you've got people to do the work, presumably.
Well, that's part of it. Like this time around, we had the damage done to the supply chain through COVID, and that's still with us and certainly hasn't gone away. It's not been spoken about, but it's still there. But fundamentally, wage increases are running well below the rate of inflation. So if you take a look at the two and say, is it wage pressures that are causing inflation, and therefore would inflation reduce those pressures? The answer is no. It's not wage rises that are causing price rises right now. It's increases in markups. And that has got far more to do with the power of firms to set prices than it has to do with workers to set wage demands.
We've talked about money supply a bit in the last couple of hours, haven't we? So, I mean, I think it's relevant here as well. If you say you take on a million extra people within the country, you need to increase the money supply to accommodate that extra million, don't you? I mean, it's not like and that either is going to, as we've said many times, either comes from government spending or it comes from bank loans by, presumably by business. Otherwise, can you have productive growth? If you throw a million workers, but you've got the same money supply, you're going to be held back by the supply of money in the economy.
Yeah, there's many contradictory things that our policymakers are doing right now. And if you want to have a growing population and believe you're going to get a growing GDP out of it, and you need a growing money supply. And, we have politicians trying not to increase the money supply by running or trying to run surpluses. So, I think in some we'd be better off with a headless chook than the chook with the head we've got at the moment.
So I'm trying to figure whether there's a path for inflation in all of that then. So let's call it a million. It was 600,000. But anyway, as near as damn it. So you've got a million extra people coming into the country. You're not expanding the money supply. So you're not getting the growth. Does that impact inflation at all? I mean, I guess you'd say, well, actually, it should be deflationary, shouldn't it, if anything?
It's more like the deflate wages. I mean, I still remember when I was living in the UK and being, I was tidy once and I used to cook too, but both of those have gone out the window with my obsession on getting my work attacking mainstream economics. So I hired a cleaner, and I think I had somebody coming in who was ethnically Russian. He was working for £7 an hour, which I just found disgustingly low. I paid him more than that.
You paid $7.50. You were so generous. Oh, yes, you bastard, paying someone £7 an hour.
I paid an extra hour for each hour she worked, right. Each day she worked. But what you found was I couldn't imagine how anybody would live on that amount of money in London. And it reminds me of a brilliant article I remember reading right back in 1973 in a book called The Political Economy of Australian Capitalism. The best book article in the lot was by a Macquarie University academic with an unforgettable name of Marie de Leprevanche, and she looked at the attitudes to migration at different times through Australia's history. And what she found was the biggest opponents to the current wave of immigration were the migrants in the previous wave of immigration. Because what would happen is the new immigrants would take on the jobs, the shitty jobs that the local workers didn't want to do, work at a lower wage for those jobs. They'd be slotted into them. They'd work their butt off to become part of the culture. Once they'd become established, then they saw the same. They were the ones who saw themselves as most likely to lose jobs to the new wave of migration.
Well, do you know what? So Patricia Cortez, who's at Boston University, their School of Business there, she did an analysis. And she found just that. The impact of low-skilled migrants was that they tended to take away work from other low-skilled migrants rather than from low-skilled natives. So it forces down, actually immigration was forcing down the wages for migrants, but not the intrinsic population, which is interesting.
Yeah, and so that's quite a common thread. I mean, that doesn't stop the locals being particularly racist about new migrants, of course. You get a combination of the two, but the ones who tend to suffer most in terms of their income stream from new migration are the most recent wave of migrants before them.
So, okay, before we take a break then, so is the Fed and every other central bank, are they wrong to be preoccupied with wages? I mean, you've said...
Yeah, they are. I mean, this bout of inflation is not wage-driven. And the trouble is there, and the people talk about the death of the Phillips curve. What they're talking about is the death of the proposition that wage rises cause inflation. Now, if you take a look at Phillips's own analysis, and you take particularly the look at the work of Koleski on price setting, it isn't just one factor, which is wages causing prices to change. That's what DSG models tend to focus upon, and that's what they mean by the Phillips curve. But in reality, it's the workers' wage demands, which can depend upon the unemployment rate. But it's also the markup that the corporations put, which depends upon the degree of competition they feel. And then it's the productivity. And the things which are suffering right now, which are causing inflation, are not wages. It's productivity, which is supply chain issues, and it's markups. And you want to reduce those. You don't want less workers, you want less capitalists.
Right. Look, there's a bit more to talk about with this, maybe more to do with, replacing workers. But we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I just want to take a bit of a diversion. I want to take us back to Mars, Steve, because
to Mars
because we evoked a bit of a response when we talked about Mars. I want to revisit that in just a second. It's the Debunking Economics podcast. Me and Steve Keen back in a moment.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Okay, we are talking about inflation and immigration, two contentious subjects. It seems actually that I think politicians are playing one against the other at the moment, aren't they? And that they're saying, well, look, we can get inflation down if we just have more migration. I know you don't like migration, but you don't like inflation either. So let's just have a bit more migration just to get the inflation down. Whether that works or not, I don't know. But look, we'll come back to that question in a moment. I mean, there are other factors at play as well, like aging populations. Do we need more migrants? But before we do that, look, if you go to the Debunking Economics website, there's the option for you to click on a microphone there and send us a voice message. And we got one of those. We got this from Ben this week.
I've been really enjoying the podcast. Thank you very much. All except the Elon Musk episode. I'm sorry. I can't stand the guy. I agree with Steve. Being led by engineers rather than politicians and economists would be great. But I do not believe Musk is that man. He has a Bachelor of Arts in physics. Yes, such a thing exists. And a BSc in economics. So he is primarily an economist. And once you've learned a little about his business operations, you can see how his lack of engineering has got in the way of his businesses again and again. Anyway, regardless of what anybody thinks about him, my real big problem is with the Mars colony.
And by the way, it's great, isn't it, to get just some listener feedback in this way. So I think everyone should try it. But his point on the Mars colony is that we can't live there because it's a third of what the gravity is on the Earth, and it's been shown that we can't procreate with 1/3 of gravity. That's why we're not getting astronauts, I guess.
Have you tried it?
Well, you can just imagine, can't you? You'd just be floating off. How would you get the thrust that's required? But anyway, he reckons that it's been tested. But he also makes this point: even if you could manage to procreate, you've still got this problem.
And even if we could reproduce in 1/3 Earth's gravity, the effect on pregnancy and birth would be really severe. We know that astronauts exercise in space to attempt to maintain muscle mass and bone density. You can't get a fetus to exercise. That lack of gravity would have really dire consequences on human development. But the effects of radiation and gravity on strong, healthy people would also be disastrous. After acclimatizing to Mars, there would be no going back to a high-gravity planet. The healthcare costs of maintaining colonists' health would be astronomical. I mean, if you think that the US spends 20% of its GDP on healthcare, and that's with favorable conditions, with a breathable atmosphere and good gravity. And then there's all the other problems with there being no nitrogen to grow plants, and the big problem with heat loss, making the energy requirements of running a colony unfeasible. So I say, why bother with the middleman? Don't go for an uneconomic Mars colony, just go straight for a space colony. With a space colony, you can move where the resources are, you can capture asteroids, you can have all of the solar system's wealth on tap, you can create an asteroid or a station that you could spin up to 1G gravity. You're in a vacuum, so you're insulated and protected from the leaching away of your energy by the environment around you. And you are directly working on the technologies required to move us from this solar system to another system in some kind of generational ship. Plugging all of your resources into a colony down a gravity well, I think, is just a waste. And if you were really concerned about a terrible event wiping out life on Earth, unless it's an asteroid that's literally going to shatter the Earth to pieces, you'd be so much better off building a self-sustaining colony in the crust of the Earth.
Yeah, going underground. So there we are. Some feedback, Steve.
Well,
I do feel like we're talking about, stuff that's
interesting.
Hundreds of years away.
I mean, I think we've got to talk about stuff that we do in the next 1 or 2 centuries. If we survive as a technological species that length of time, and I think the odds against that are pretty high given global warming and how we've done, thanks to economists, done bugger all about addressing it. So, like, I have sympathy for the argument about a civilization in space, on a predecessor of what are called Dyson spheres, being more likely than trying to a local planet with 1/3 the gravity under which we've evolved. But the point about Musk that people get angry about is that this was what NASA was trying to do 50 years ago. And out of curiosity, I got a tweet from an engineer called Frank Norris, who's written a book called Colonizing Mars, How It Will Happen in Our Lifetime. And he's been through the engineering issues. I very much doubt, I haven't read that far yet, that he's been through the reproduction issues. And this is true. And we don't know what's going to happen to the human form if we have an entire lifetime spent in 1/3 gravity.
Without gravity, we'll just become flabby and everyone will look English.
Even though more American.
More American, exactly. Maybe we're going that way already. Maybe we are getting ready for it.
Yeah, but I mean, this is my Hail Mary pass, and I find it amusing that people are angry about me because Musk is involved. This was what NASA was trying to do 50 years ago, and the people that shot NASA down were the same bloody economists of shooting down action on climate change. Not the same people, but the whole idea of neoliberalism, the argument you can't waste resources on things like a moonshot. We've got to make sure we don't spend more than we tax. That the neoliberalism arguments against government spending, in the belief that government spending causes inflation, our topic for this day, that was a major reason why NASA was cut back by an order of magnitude in terms of the funding that it receives. I would like to see us continue on with Apollo should never have stopped. Apollo should have been continued on, and if we'd done that, we're putting 10 times as much state resources in 50 years ago or 40 years ago compared to what we're doing now. We probably would be discussing the survival of we'd be talking about the Mars colony now because it would exist, or there'd be something using asteroids and so on. So it is the fact that Musk has intervened there is just that we stopped using the government's capacity to create money to finance actions like this. And then the inequality of capitalism has given us one mega capitalist who's got an obsession with getting, with colonizing Mars. And, you work with what you've got. I wish there was a NASA program I could be criticizing or praising. There isn't. And the reason for it is neoclassical economists once more.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, even just a more general level, just the quest for knowledge is getting held back, isn't it? I mean, as you said, we might have been there and discovered already that in Mars sex isn't very good. So
maybe it could be fabulous. Well, we'll never find out.
Perhaps maybe gravity is holding us back or down too much. Who knows? Anyway, well, I mean, you could do some interesting twists and turns, perhaps, that you can't currently do. I don't know.
Back to that questioner's perspective, I basically agree. I think that the more sensible target would be to use asteroids, you mine the asteroid belt, and to create an artificial gravity which retains the Earth's gravity effect for our biological species, while also meaning you're not trapped in a gravity well when you want to leave it. That actually is Jeff Bezos's obsession. But if you look at the two, which one has been more successful? And those are the billionaires in terms of turning their ideas from concepts into actual products. Forget Bezos; he hasn't even got to orbit yet. So this is one of these idiosyncrasies. People complain and say, "Oh, why did you choose that? You should have chosen blah." I choose Musk work because it bloody well exists.
Right, Ben's got another.
Anyway, so
well, there we are. Ben's got another question as well, which we'll leave to the end. Just want to finish off on migration. So I wonder whether a better measure, if you were trying to put some sort of formula together to say, well, how many migrants should we have? I mean, surely if you are taking in people from the country in the belief that they are helping to bridge a gap, a labour shortage, then you would do it so long as your GDP per capita is increasing. If your GDP per capita is decreasing, then obviously it's a bad decision.
Yeah, and that's the point that's left out of it. Again, this is one of the trivialities of human behaviour. We should ideally be looking at GDP per capita. Again, we don't look at the distribution of income, and that is another huge mistake. But we're even making a foundational mistake talking about income rather than income per head. So we're looking at the wrong average. And so this is just a sign of how trivialized our political discourse is, that you can we talk a lot about productivity, which is obviously exactly the same thing, isn't it? Yeah.
In fact, I read somewhere that labour income is about 60% of total income, so 60 pence in earnings generates £1 in GDP on average. So you'd be wanting, presumably, to see that go down. You'd want it because that would mean greater productivity.
Well, it would also mean as greater share going to capitalists, and that's one of our problems. Like there's a very intricate battle, and Richard Goodwin covered this very well, between workers and capitalists in terms of innovation, because a large part of the technological progress we've been through is because capitalists are trying to reduce wages in their particular wage costs in their particular industry sector. And then by doing it, what you get is higher productivity in terms of capacity to produce output over time. And the classic example there is the spinning jenny. Why was it invented in Scotland, apart from the fact that a Scottish person came up with it? And I've forgotten the actual academic who did the comparison, but if you looked at the original spinning jenny, which had basically 6 spinning wheels being turned by one person rather than one spinning wheel turned by one person, then of course it was automated and you had hundreds being turned by steam power and water power and so on. But the original jump from 1 to 6 meant that you could replace one worker, and a machine could replace 6 workers and 6 individualized machines. Yeah. Well, but that was only profitable. That was only profitable in Scotland because wages were substantially higher than they were in France. We did the comparison.
Right. And then and Japan would be the most an example of that today, wouldn't it? In that, Japan is they've got their own problems, as we've talked about in the past, but they are a highly productive nation because they are heavily mechanized, because they've got fewer people, higher wages.
And so the wage, if you didn't have high wages, you have less encouragement to innovate at the same time. So that income distribution struggle is part of what motivates technological development in capitalism. And so there are issues about immigration and population and so on, but everything is trivialized by putting it in a neoclassical framework, and even more so trivialized when politicians talk about GDP growth without talking about GDP per capita.
We are starting to see more of that, though. We are seeing GDP per capita even being mentioned by politicians, normally opposition politicians, but at least it's being the point is being made. The thing is, of course, with migration, how much is going to be needed to replace native workers who are getting older, they're opting out of work. So there's a Deutsche Bank study last year that showed there were 830,000 fewer UK-born workers in the labour force than at the end of 2019. So if you don't replace them, with migrants, there's a lot of productivity increase that's needed to replace 830,000 workers, isn't there?
And there's also the question of whether we're having contracting workforces, which partially also can potentially increase the bargaining power of workers. But again, we're now seeing robotics being developed to the point where it's feasible that a lot of manual work can be overtaken by robots. And that's probably the scariest change that I've been anticipating this for quite some time, but to see it starting to happen right now with the type of robotics that are being developed and using artificial neural networks are the main form of artificial intelligence that drives those robots. They can be trained to pattern recognize, and you can replace a huge amount of manual work with them. And what that means is workers get screwed compared to capitalists, because it'll be the capitalists buying the robots, putting them in factories. You don't need the unskilled labor anymore to produce the output, but then, of course, what you hit is the aggregate demand in the economy.
So if you've got more people coming in and therefore you're not getting that investment, which is increasing productivity, then, there's an argument there, perhaps, at least in the short term, that that increase in manual labour could be inflationary.
Yeah,
because you're not getting the productivity gains from the investment.
Yeah. Well, to me, it's we skirt around the income inequality effects of things like immigration. And when you look at who's in favour of large-scale immigration, it tends to be the business lobbies, because they know that you're going to have extra workers who want, looking for work in low-skilled areas. That reduces the bargaining power of domestic trade unions. So a huge part of the opposition to immigration has come from workers who realise this is how employers are using immigration to weaken their bargaining power. So, it's a dirty area of politics, because I'm somebody, I'll come out overall sounding like I'm anti-immigration, and generally speaking, that is correct. But at the same time, I saw the other side of immigration is the mixing of cultures and the introduction of new cultural trends that come out of people from a different culture moving to yours. And you were lucky you weren't in Australia in the 50s, mate. You would have died of boredom with the food, because tell you what, it was as bad as England.
Yeah. And that's saying something. When you can't be against immigration anyway, Steve, because you lived and worked in 4 countries now.
I'm an immigrant. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
So you're one of them. So, but there are those people who believe, we should just have total free markets, that we should be able to, there shouldn't be controls on migration. You should be able to move to wherever the work is. And that's the best outcome for society, for economies. How would that work out?
I think we're fine. You wouldn't get paid.
You wouldn't get paid very much.
All this stuff is skirting around the issue of relative power. And immigration has got all sorts of components to it as well. A large number of immigrants to New Zealand are people who are building themselves survival bunkers for the collapse of capitalism, when they themselves are capitalists. So immigrants into England, I wonder how many of them potentially are, Saudi Arabians trying to hide wealth and Russians trying to hide wealth and so on. So it's a very dirty area of politics overall, and it tends to appeal to the reactionary and the divisive in human psyche, which makes it very uncomfortable to find myself, for reasons apart from that, being in favour of restricting migration and trying to increase the bargaining power of domestic workers.
But to replace domestic workers in countries where you've got a lower population, it's sort of a necessity, isn't it?
Again, it comes down to this obsession about growth. Do we want to be growing all the time? I see people, and this is actually, I'm very happy to differ with Elon Musk. He's a person obsessed about population growth. I think there's far too many humans already, and I'd rather see us finding a way to reduce population and increase equality while we do the same together. But with the obsession of immigration and growing a population, the big country arguments that Australia still uses, and then the large corporations supporting immigration because it weakens the bargaining power of existing workers. It's just a very dirty area of human politics.
Yeah. All right. And in terms of, so our overarching question, this idea that inflation is being caused because of wage push, and if we had more immigrants coming into a country, then that would loosen the labour market, so you'd have less wage push. You just don't go with that argument.
No, I don't buy it. Not on current data. Again, I've only looked at the American situation because again, the Americans tend to have the best data. But you break down the causes of inflation in the post-COVID period. There's a small period where wage growth exceeded the rate of inflation, but for the vast period of the COVID and for most of the post-1970s period, the major contributor to increasing prices in terms of what's been growing faster than the rate of inflation, it's the growth of markups. So if you want to reduce inflation, you need less capitalists. Not exactly what people want to hear.
And more price control. Yeah, which imagine how well that would go down with a conservative government.
Brilliantly.
All right, now look. So Ben, he finished off his tirade with a question. He said he calmed down, came back, left another message, and said, "Here's a question for you."
I'd like to ask a question around economics, and that is if either of you have heard of Dr. Edgar Feige, of the University of Wisconsin, who came up with, as far as I'm aware, the idea of the automated transaction tax that would replace all other taxes within the economy. I was wondering if you're familiar with it, what you thought about it, what criticisms you could find, because it's a really appealing idea, especially bearing in mind modern monetary theory. And I'm really struggling to find any criticism or much discussion about it. So I'd be really interested for your thoughts on Dr. Feige's automated transaction tax.
Right.
Thank you very much.
So he was a student of Milton Friedman, by the way. So let's not hold that against him.
I support that idea. So actually, I might get us to replay that after we finish recording and get the name down properly. But I think income tax is one of the major encouragers of right-wing thinking these days, because people see money being taken out of their bank account. They don't see money being paid into it by government spending on the other side. And income tax is easily evaded by the rich. It's very difficult for the middle class and the poor to evade income tax. So what started off as a way of financing government spending, so it was thought, when you look at it from an MMT lens, it's actually taking excess money creation out of circulation. I'd rather do it by automated transaction tax. So inherently, I think that's a good idea.
But couldn't it be, it sounds a bit regressive though, doesn't it?
It depends on what transactions. I mean, at the moment, we tax, VAT, we tax goods and services. We're not taxing every financial transaction. Now, if you whacked a financial transaction tax, and there were what used to be called a Tobin tax,
and it was the same amount as VAT. So yeah, if you say, VAT is going to be 20%, well, if you're going to invest your money expecting a return, you're going to have to pay 20% on that as well. That would that would focus the mind a bit.
Yeah, but certainly the thing is, corporations and rich people can't avoid transactions. Okay, if you're going to be enjoying part of the wealth of a country in some fashion, you're going to be buying something or other, and then you could also have a demurrage tax. I'd like to have a demurrage tax on large accumulations of wealth. So you want ways to take that excess money out of circulation. At the moment, using income tax, it tends to screw the middle class and leads to right-wing attitudes in general, and negative attitudes towards government itself, coming out of how government takes money out of circulation, not out of government financing.
Okay, well, we'll look at that next week. So Edgar Feige is the guy's name. He's been pushing this.
I'm going to throw something back to Ben because this is intriguing. I was just reading this book, Colonizing Mars, and this is by an engineer who worked with NASA for 50 or so years and was involved in planning part of what they were going to do with the NASA intention of colonizing both the moon and Mars. And intriguingly enough, not in 2022, so just a couple of years ago, he's talking about the metrics of the Starship and says, assuming monstrous pumps that can load 30 tons per minute, it would still take at least almost 3 hours. He's talking about fueling the booster and the Starship together. In the third flight, which was just a couple of weeks ago, they fueled it in 45 minutes. not 3 hours. So that's what's intriguing to me is, regardless of whether Musk is actually doing the engineering, it seems the environment he has put in place around that, the whole SpaceX episode is leading to rates of engineering change that engineers themselves are going to be stunned by. And that's the intriguing thing I find, that the rate of innovation, I don't think Musk is dreaming up the ideas, but something about the atmosphere in SpaceX is causing a ludicrous rate of innovation. And that innovation should have been happening under the NASA program. It's not. So I'm supporting what exists in that front. And, yes, I'd prefer asteroids, but we're not. If Bezos is having the results that Musk was, I'd be supporting Bezos in this thing. But
you're supporting private enterprise though against government, aren't you? So that's the interesting thing. But anyway,
that comes down to, we should actually talk about that again. That's Mariana Mazzucato and Bill Janeway about who can afford to finance innovation.
Yeah, you've got to have a lot of money to be able to do that. Yeah, interesting point.
Yeah,
so
right.
We'll talk about Edgar Feige's idea next week on the podcast. We won't talk about Mars or space. We'll just talk about taxation next. No, so it's over for a while now. We're not going to revisit that because we get a flood of complaints. So we'll park that for a while, but we'll talk tax. But you've got to find some negatives on this. We can't just come on and say, Edgar Feige, great idea, let's do it. We've got to find some weaknesses, or at least something to talk around on that. But we'll do that next week. Thanks for listening today. Thank you as well, Ben, for your contribution. Thanks, Steve. We'll catch you next week.
Okay, Matt. Bye.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.